Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's talk, Goya's Materials and Techniques. My name is Felicity, and I am from the Audience Engagement team at the NGV and will be your host for today's presentation. Ordinarily, we would begin by acknowledging that we speak on the lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne, and recognise the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people as the traditional owners of the land on which the NGV is built. However, as we are coming to you remotely today, I would also like to acknowledge that many people present in today's talk may be on the lands of traditional custodians, and I'd like to pay my respect to those communities wherever they are as well. I am delighted to introduce our speakers for today, Cathy Leahy, Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings at the NGV, Ruth Shervington, Senior Conservator of Paper at the NGV, and Louise Wilson, Conservator of Paper at the NGV. So pleased to have you with us, everybody. Cathy will begin with an introduction to Goya.
Thanks, Felicity, and hello, everybody. And it's a great pleasure to be here today for this virtual presentation that's been prepared to accompany the NGV's current exhibition, Goya, Drawings from the Prado Museum. And this is a really special exhibition that's taken us several years to bring to fruition. We've been negotiating with the Prado Museum in Madrid for several years and working with their team have secured a loan of 44 marvellous drawings by Goya. And they're the largest group of drawings by Goya ever to be seen in Australia. And they've been very specially selected by our two teams to work together in tandem with Melbourne's very strong Goya print holdings. And so the drawings are exhibited together with the prints to give an overview of Goya as this extraordinary draftsman and printmaker. In the presentation today, Ruth and Louise will be focusing on Goya's print techniques and his work as a printmaker. And I'm going to start off by giving you just a bit of a background, very brief, of Goya's life and development and those major print series. So we're starting here with a self-portrait of Goya when he's about 52 years of age. And this print is the frontispiece, as you can see, to the Los Caprichos series, which was Goya's most famous series of prints. And Goya shows himself here in a fashionable top hat, and he's casting a sardonic glance to the side. And at the time that he produced this series, Goya was the most celebrated artist in Spain. He was renowned. He worked for the Spanish court. He was director of the painting at the Royal Academy, and he was really highly regarded for and sought after for his portraits and religious painting. But he was also a brilliant draftsman and printmaker. And following a near fatal illness in 1793, just a few years prior to making this print, this illness that left him permanently deaf and profoundly deaf, Goya turned to drawing and printmaking to express his innermost thoughts and visions. And he continued this practice right until the end of his life. So in contrast to his commissioned portraits and religious painting, and they were commissioned by, Goya's prints and drawings weren't financed by a patron, and this gave him the freedom to critique the social ills of his day and give free rein to his imagination. And if we move to the next slide, thanks Felicity, this is what we see in this first famous series of prints, Los Caprichos. Spain in the late 18th century was still steeped in superstition and governed by anachronistic laws. However, the Enlightenment was also beginning to make an impact in the country, and Goya was closely involved with a progressive circle of enlightened thinkers and statesmen. They were trying to modernise Spain through wide-ranging social, religious, educational and economic reforms. We see the impact of these liberal reformist ideas in Los Caprichos, in which Goya satirised human foible, the social and political corruption rife in contemporary Spain, as well as ignorance and superstition. Prostitution and arranged marriages were some of the social ills critiqued by Spain's enlightened reformers in the 1790s, and Goya takes up the theme of the relations between men and women in many images, producing commentaries on rituals of courtship, forced marriage and prostitution. The image on the left here, There They Go Plucked, shows a brothel scene where the sex workers sweep away the spent-out clients to make way for their moneyed successors who are flying in the top right. Here, Goya uses caricature to transform the men into grotesque bird-like creatures in order to express their moral degradation. Reform of childhood education also preoccupied progressive thinkers and is reflected in numerous prints made by Goya. Here comes the bogeyman on the right. In this, we see Goya criticising the way in which parents instill superstitious beliefs and fears in their children. If we move to the next slide, we can see images that relate to Goya's anti-clerical view, in which he criticised the clergy's corruption in the image on the left, laziness and immoral behaviour. In They Are Hot on the left, Goya shows a group of clergy shoveling food into their mouths, the print's title also alluding to their lasciviousness. Goya also used animals to satirise various members of society, such as doctors, teachers, and also aristocrats, such as we see here on the right in And So Was His Grandfather, which shows a well-dressed ass looking through his family tree with great pride, his family crest also showing an ass resting before the great. In the second half of the Los Caprichos series, and in the next image, is introduced by Goya's most famous print, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. This image shows the artist asleep at a desk surrounded by nocturnal owls and bats, with the title, Sleep of Reason, written on the desk front. The prominence given to the nocturnal creatures suggests the limits of reason and that we only have to be dormant for an instant for the irrational to be unleashed. In the prints that follow in Los Caprichos, Goya's commentary on human vice becomes more savage as he introduces a cast of supernatural creatures, including witches and goblins, to critique superstition, ignorance, and immoral behaviour. And we can see some of these creatures in the next slide. Stories of goblins and witches were still prevalent in Goya's lifetime. Great. And in images such as these goblins on the left, who are shown carousing with greedy monks, and also images of witches on the right, involved in illicit carnal activity and prostitution. The image in the middle, contemporary, which is called Trials, contemporary viewers interpreted as showing young novice witches learning their trade in adultery. And the image on the right, Blow, which shows an image, which shows a witch using a child as a bellows to fan flames in a brazier, was seen as a condemnation of the carnal trade in children. Of course, such critical images were dangerous in a country where the Inquisition was still active, and Goya withdrew Los Caprichos from sale only 2 days after he advertised the series in early 1799. The political situation in Spain deteriorated in the early years of the 19th century, and in late 1807, Napoleon's forces invaded Spain. And if we move to the next slide, we can see, and this invasion triggered the Peninsular War, 6 long years of bloodshed, guerrilla combat, heroic resistance, and savage reprisal. Goya began working on a new etching series, The Disasters of War, probably in 1810, in which he graphically portrayed the atrocities of war as well as the terrible sufferings of the civilians during the devastating famine in Madrid in 1811-12. These are some of the most radical images of warfare ever produced, pursuing the representation of heroic deeds or patriotic martyrs to present 80 harrowing images of cruelty and suffering that highlight humanity's capacity for violence. We see a new realism in these etching plates, such as in the delicate handling of the figures in the piles of corpses in the image on the left, all this on more. And in the image on the right is thought to represent a woman who defended the city of Zaragoza during the siege in 1808. And it raises the interesting issue of whether Goya, how much of the war Goya saw, and we think actually very little, but that he based his images on imagination, drawing upon reports that widely circulated. If we move to the next slide, we see other images such as a woman being attacked by a soldier on the left. So there are rape scenes and mutilation scenes in this series as well. And on the right, we see a staged execution scene, which is almost cinematic in its effect. Here we see the blindfolded Spaniard before the long rifle barrels of the French soldiers who are actually depicted beyond this picture frame. And this kind of device really engages the viewer, involves them in the scene almost, it gives it a real immediacy. So when the French were finally expelled in 1813 and the Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, restored to power in May 1814, a new reign of terror began. Rather than the longed-for peace and stability, Ferdinand reinstated the old systems of government and the Inquisition and persecuted many of the liberals who had cooperated with the French. This dark period is reflected in a final sequence of allegorical plates in the series that attack the abuses of church and state. And although Goya expended considerable effort on the series over a 5-year period, the disasters of war were never published in Goya's lifetime, presumably because of the satirical nature of some of these plates, and that would have been dangerous for Goya. In 1815, Goya began work on an etched set of bullfight scenes known as Pura Makia. And this series stressed the violence of the national pastime. And Goya had actually been an aficionado of the bullfight when he was a young man, but by this later date, his position on bullfighting was much more aligned to that of a enlightened opinion. So when Goya actually published this series, unlike the Disasters of War, this one was published, and they're really very beautiful etchings, very refined in their technique. But despite this, the series was a commercial failure. And again, in these images, we see an emphasis upon on violent acts and barbarous customs, such as in the image on the left, where we see the disabling of the bull by the severing of its hamstring tendons. And in the image, and there's a whole sequence of images in the series of 33 prints that focus on the madcap antics of some of the most famous bullfighters, which Goya saw as reckless and irrational, such as this image here on the right of Juanito Apinani, who vaulting using a pole over the bull. We move now to the last series of etchings that Goya made in his life, and that also date from these really repressive post-war years. And the terrible situation in Spain, both political and social, really gives rise to the kind of really dark imagery that we see in this series of prints, which are very enigmatic, and they were executed sometime between 1815 and 1819, and they share a kinship in both their dark tonalities and their enigmatic subject matter with Goya's black paintings, his extraordinary series of murals that he painted on the walls of his villa on the outskirts of Madrid. And so the Disparate series continue the themes of violence, superstition, and nightmarish visions of his earlier etched series, but with a darker, more irrational inflection. Several of the images seem to relate to Carnival, when social rules and conventions are abandoned. So, for example, the figure on the left, Bobalicon, was an oversized buffoon that performed at Spanish carnivals. Other prints return to themes or figures from the Caprichos, but the moralizing tone of the earlier works has now transformed into a kind of grotesque scenery. The image on the right, Disorderly Folly, for example, shows a mismatched couple caught in a loveless union, and here their bodies have fused at torso and head, and they are joined together in eternal anguish, and their torment is witnessed by a crowd of grotesque creatures. As with the Disasters of War series, Goya didn't publish, the Disparates in his lifetime. And in fact, he didn't complete the series, but in fact left the plates, the 22 plates, in a crate locked up in his villa when he went into self-imposed exile in 1823. And Goya chose to leave Spain following Ferdinand's really repressive crackdown on liberals from 1823. He was 78 years old when he arrived in Bordeaux, and he spent there the last 4 years of his life, which were extraordinarily productive ones. He threw himself into a whole array of new projects, learning lithography, a new print technique, and producing great albums of drawings. And these last years really give witness to his undiminished powers of invention and creativity. And so while Goya's subject matter is often dark and disturbing, his penetration into the darker realms of the human psyche and critique of the human condition makes his work compelling and universal. The artist's astonishing powers of observation and invention are most clearly evident in his prints and drawings, which remain the most remarkable productions of his oeuvre. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Ruth Shervington and to Louise Wilson, who are now going to give us the insight into Goya's techniques and materials. Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you, Cathy. Thank you for providing this brief background into Goya's Spain at this time and the major print series. And it's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about the techniques and the materials in more depth. Needless to say, Louise and I have found it a great pleasure studying and examining the prints we have in the NGV collection. And learning more about 18th century Spain regarding availability of materials and knowledge of techniques at the time. Now, to begin today's talk, I'll head first to Goya and his primary printmaking technique, which was intaglio, and the many associated techniques that could be and were combined. It can be confounding to try and unravel how he achieved certain effects and in what order the various processes were carried out. We hope that by understanding how techniques were undertaken, it will allow you to read prints in more detail. This, in turn, will give an insight into Goya's working practice. Intaglio prints are created by making a recessed groove in a metal printing plate, either physically by incising into the surface with metal tools, or chemically by etching into the plate with acid, or a combination of the two. Next slide, please. Felicity. Copper was the most common metal type used for printmaking plates during Goya's lifetime. Several of Goya's surviving copper plates, the Los Disparates and La Pura Makia, bear stamps on the verso indicating they were sourced from a London coppersmith and copper plate maker, William and Russell Pontifex and Company. This company had operated in London since the 1770s under various names and counted many well-known artists such as Gainsborough, Blake and Turner as customers. As one might expect, I'll just first say that the slide here, the one on the left is a copper plate in the NGV collection. It's not Goya's, unfortunately. It's actually a Lionel Lindsay copper plate, but it just gives you a sense of what it looks like once it's been once it's had the printmaking done to it. And there's a stamp on the right from the Pontifex Company. So moving on, as one might expect, material supplies for Goya's second heart-wrenching series the disasters of war, was directly impacted by the Peninsular War and the subsequent years of famine. French invaders, Spanish guerrillas and bandits blocked paths and roads into Madrid, interrupting supply of food and general provisions. Examination of the copper plates used to produce the series indicates Goya had to make do with defective copper plate and is likely to have concealed imperfections with aquatint or recycled plates by turning them over and working on the reverse, or by scraping them down and burnishing them to reuse the front. This example here, the landscape on the left, in fact, was cut in two for plates in the disasters of war, and you can see the two on the right, which are half the size. So those two plates on the right, if you look at the reverse of the plate, have a half image of the landscape. So moving on, Goya was a prolific draftsman and filled many albums with his drawings. Of these drawings, he certainly used many to translate into intaglio prints, and this was the case for his first notable series of Los Caprichos, published, as Cathy said, in 1799. And his use of albums and drawings, transferring them into prints, continued on through his life. There are several methods for transferring a drawing onto a copper plate, but in most cases, the first stage is preparing the plate with ground layer. A ground is a waxy, acid-resistant material that is applied by heating the copper plate so that the ground melts and can be spread evenly over the surface. Several types of ground are used for various purposes, hard ground being suited to etching, and the type probably most used by Goya. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, most hard ground recipes contained wax, such as beeswax or white wax, asphaltum, and resin, such as burgundy pitch, which is an extrusion from the Norway or European spruce, or gum, such as gum mastic. Grounds were laborious to prepare, requiring the gradual amalgamation of the ingredients before bringing them to boil and letting the mixture cool so that the resulting mass could be kneaded into balls and wrapped in silk. To apply the ground, the copper plate was heated and the ground, which is still wrapped in silk, placed on the surface, slowly melting it so it could be spread evenly over the plate. The ground was sometimes darkened with smoke to enhance its contrast with the gleaming copper lines that become exposed when the artist was transferring the composition onto the plate. In the slide, you see a man, if we could just go back a moment, back, please, Felicity. Yes, that's a man smoking the base of the plate on the left. And then in the image on the right, the two lumps, the dark black one is a hard ground and the one in front is a soft ground in that picture. And there are the tapering candles that would have been used. So moving along now. Some of Goya's drawings have blackened lines around the edges, indicating he may have used a hard ground that had been smoked. And some of those were displayed in the exhibition. Goya's preferred method of transferring a chalk drawing onto a copper plate involved dampening the paper, placing the work face down on the top of a copper plate, and passing them through the printing press. Some of the friable chalk media would transfer onto the ground, providing a vague guide for him to follow with his etching needle. It's not surprising that some of the smoked hard ground at the edges of the plate transferred onto the drawing in the process. There is also evidence that Goya transferred his ink drawings in the same way, which leads us to suspect he may have used a paler ground, paler in colour and possibly softer to allow the ink to partially transfer. And now I shall pass over to Louise, who will continue with the process and explain the image forming techniques.
Thanks very much, Ruth. He used a lot of different techniques, and I'm just going to discuss a few, but we have done an ebook, so you'll be able to explore some of the other techniques further if you delve into that. But the first one I want to talk about is etching. So the image here on the left, you can see a copper plate that's been prepared in the way that Ruth described. So it's already got the hard ground on it that's been smoked. So it's really lovely and dark. And this is us actually in the paper conservation studio experimenting with an etching needle and just using a very fluid, it is like a loose drawing technique, and you push and you pull the needle just as you would a pen through that hard ground just to expose the underlying copper. Not a lot of force is used. All you're wanting to do is make the copper visible. So then when you move on to the second step, which is the image we can see on the right, applying the aquafortis, which is a combination of acid and water, the aquafortis then can reach the copper and start eating into it. And in this image on the right, this is from a treatise that Ruth has already shown you a picture from. It's written by Abraham Bossi in about 1704, but in Goya's time, this treatise was actually translated into Spanish, and so it was available in Madrid when he was working. So it's possible he was quite familiar with this image and may have sometimes used this setup to etch his plates. So there's a tray that's on an angle. It's got some little pegs there that you can just slot your copper plate onto. And then there's a receptacle at the bottom that's got the aquafortis in it. And probably in Goya's time, the aquafortis was made from a combination of nitric acid, and water. And the ratio could change, but the usual ratio was 1 part acid to 4 parts water. Anyway, he would have perhaps got the jug and scooped out some of the aquafortis and poured it over the copper plate and just kept doing that process over and over until the lines were the depth and the width that he wanted. And of course, the deeper and the wider the lines are, the more ink that they will hold when you come to inking up the plate for printing. But now I'd like to just show you what the lines look like close up. And we have an image coming up that's taken again by Ruth and I in the paper studio using our microscope, which has a camera attachment. And this beautiful work from Los Caprichos, we zoomed in on the ear of the donkey just to show you what etched lines look like. But you won't need a microscope in future when you're looking at etchings to be able to try and pick what an etched line is. Usually they're quite uniform along their length, as you can see here, but the really defining characteristic of them is their ends. So they've got a really clipped off, blunt little end. And that's the way that we identify them. And when you go to exhibitions and look at etchings, that's the way you'll be able to pick them as well. And the next linear technique that I'd like to talk about is dry point. Oh, sorry, no, I'm racing ahead. I will tell you one more thing about etching, which is sometimes Goya did this thing called overbiting, where he exposed the plate to acid for a prolonged period, or he used stronger acid. So instead of having individual lines of etching, the little copper walls between the lines would break down, and that would create an open expanse that could then hold ink. And he's used this to great effect here in the bull from this particular work from Pura Makia, where all of the little lines have broken down between the eyes of the bull and going down the nose. So there's just this lovely flat expanse of copper that could then hold quite a deal of ink, and it's printed this beautiful rich black in the finished print. Great, thank you. Now to move on to the next linear technique, which I think is dry point, yes. Ruth will talk in a moment about the printing of the plates, but sort of as he was going along, once he'd done the etched lines, he might like to ink up the plate and take a print just to see how the image was looking. And if he wanted to rework a certain area, add a little bit more shading perhaps, or just a bit more emphasis, he might use this other technique called dry point. And that's what he's done here on this particular work from Pura Makia on the matador who's on the right. So the circled area, we then see what it looks like down the microscope. And you can see those quite beautiful, soft, furry lines that go around his shoulder there. They're done with a dry point needle. So it looks a little bit like the etched needle, but it's actually usually thicker at the end than an etching needle, and it's quite a strong metal, usually a steel. And unlike etching, where you're using physical and chemical means, so you're using the scratching of the needle plus the aquafortis to create the line, with dry point you're only using physical force. And you do have to push the needle fairly robustly because it's a little bit like ploughing a field going through the copper. So you're creating a furrow in the copper, but as you're creating that furrow, you're throwing up copper on either side. So you end up with this beautiful divot going along with a burr on either side, and both that divot or furrow and the burr can hold ink. So you end up with these lovely kind of indistinct, soft, furry lines. And it's really that furriness that is the giveaway when you're looking at a dry point and trying to identify a dry point line. And I really love this photo micrograph because you can see those dry point lines are surrounded by all etched lines, and you can really quite clearly see the difference between them. The etched lines are much more clear and even along their length, and they've got those blunt ends that I told you about earlier. Thank you, Felicity. The last linear technique that I'd like to tell you about is engraving, and this is another one that would be done perhaps after he'd printed up, done a working proof after the etching, and just perhaps add a few little extra lines to the composition. These images are again taken from that treatise that Goya may have been familiar with. The images on the left show at the top what the tool looks like, and the tool is called a burin, excuse me, and it's set into a timber handle. And underneath that you can see the different ways that you angle that tool to sharpen it on a stone. You've really got to keep sharpening and keeping that blade nice and keen as you're working along. On the right, you can see how you hold the burin, and we're super lucky at the NGV. We have a little set of burins that once belonged to Lionel Lindsay. So Ruth and I have had the opportunity to try and work out how it is that you hold them, and it isn't a natural feel, but you can really, they are really made perfectly for sitting in the palm of your hand. And then the image at the top on the right shows you how you might set up your workspace. So Goya may have perhaps on his bench in his studio had a little pad that he then angled the copper plate on. And he would have been pushing the burin away from him to dislodge little ribbons in the copper. And in a moment, we'll show you what these lines look like close up so that when you come to look at prints, you'll be able to see what an engraved line looks like. And we have a photo micrograph that was taken down the microscope. This is of the same work again from Pura Makia. So on the left, you can see where we've circled the area that we're looking at up close. So this is, they used to put firecrackers on the bulls' necks, and this is the smoke that's coming from the firecrackers. So if you could just ignore for a moment in the photo micrograph that dark pooling that's going across the upper left corner, because I'll talk about that in a minute. We're just looking about those light, very beautifully tapered lines of the engraving. So the distinctive thing about an engraved line is that it does kind of just taper off into a little V shape, into nothing, and that's the distinctive feature to look for. So now I want to move on to tonal techniques, and Goya was one of the early adopters of a technique known as aquatint. He was one of the first artists in Spain, and he was a really master of it. So in this work, which Cathy showed you earlier, is in fact created entirely using aquatint. It's an incredible technical achievement. And on the right, on the left, sorry, we see some of the materials that Ruth showed you earlier. So you've got that beautiful big lump of the rosin, which he would have ground, perhaps using a mortar and pestle, to a powder form. And sometimes he ground it, it looks like in his prints at least, that sometimes he ground it very fine, others a bit coarser. Another ingredient that he would have used is asphaltum, and that was also ground in a mortar and pestle. And there are a few ways to then apply the aquatint. One of the ways would be to put that powder in a little bit of muslin and make a little pouch. So that's what we can see in that circle as well. It's just a little muslin pouch. And if we imagine him taking that across to the copper plate that was used to produce, and so was his grandfather, he would just be shaking that over the copper plate. But you can see in the background of this print that the tone isn't even, that he's actually managed to put more of the dust ground in some areas than others. And so he'd do that just by manipulating the height that he was holding the muslin bag, or perhaps just shaking in a particular area for longer. So that is the basic recipe for the aquatint, but of course, Goya's not working in a beautiful air-conditioned studio these times, you know, in summer in particular, it would be quite hot in there. So all of these recipes that we're telling you about would be tweaked a little bit according to the seasons. One little tweak that I think must have happened with this particular print is the donkeys in the book that he's looking at. You think, well, how could he possibly apply that by dusting aquatint onto the plate? And the answer is, well, in fact, he didn't. He instead mixed that aquatint, the ground ingredients, with alcohol. And in this case, it was painted on, and then the alcohol evaporated off, leaving the grains of aquatint in those areas. So he's got two techniques happening in this one print, two ways of applying the aquatint. And now we'll just move on to one other tonal technique, which links in with things that Cathy and Ruth have already spoken to you about the Peninsular War, and particularly Ruth's reference to the pliers being difficult to obtain. And while aquatint was used a lot in the other series, another technique is used more in Disasters of War, and it's called Leahy, which means wash in French, and it's known as direct etching. So the image on the left, which comes from the Disasters of War series, that beautiful, even, pale ground background is achieved by simply brushing the aquafortis directly onto the plate. And he would have probably used a brush or a feather or something like that to apply it. And it's probably because rosin and asphaltum were not very easy to find during these years. It is a technique that's used a little bit in some of the other series, and again, we've got it, if you remember that, back to that photo micrograph I showed you earlier with the engraved lines, that pooling that was across the upper left corner, which is taken from the smoke of the firecrackers, that was achieved using direct etching, but it's really the Disasters of War where you see it used a lot. So now I'll hand back to Ruth so she can tell you more about how the prints were actually printed. Thank you.
Okay. Printing treatises from the 18th century describe the making of ink at length and discuss the use of weak and strong oil combined with dry pigment to make black printing ink. Weak oil is not heated to the same extent as strong oil, resulting in differences in their flowing quality. Weak oil being more mobile and ideally suited to intaglio techniques, where it migrates down into the incised lines and aquatint pits, while strong oil is more viscous, producing an ink with short tack that sits on the surface of the plate, making it ideally suited to relief techniques like wood engraving, though it's more commonly used on wooden blocks. Many of Goya's prints are printed using a brown-coloured ink, often described as sepia ink. However, it's unlikely that it would be true sepia ink, as this was highly expensive to manufacture, coming from squid or cuttlefish, and is difficult to store. So it's more likely that it was a brown pigment in with a mixture of brown pigment and probably some black in with the oil. During the 19th century, both dabbers and rollers were available for applying ink to the plate. In this picture, we see a dabber. Like the silk-covered dabber that was used to spread ground layer onto the copper plate, dabbers were for applying ink were covered in linen or leather. The ink was applied in thin, sequential layers, taking care to apply it evenly. Once all the grooves and pits in the copper plate were filled with ink, the surface of the plate would be wiped of excessive ink. In some cases, a light film of ink was left on the surface as a way of creating a subtle layer of tone in the print. This is known as plate tone, and it has been used to great effect in some of the NGV prints, where it has been combined with deliberate, uneven wiping to add shading and form. A stiff fabric, such as tarlatan, is usually used to wipe the plate of ink, and there are various grades of weave to catch the ink. It's a bit difficult to see the pad of the tarlatan down in the lower right corner. So moving on. The NGV's Los Caprichos impressions are printed on fine quality paper that was probably sourced from Genoa in Italy's Ligurian region. Sorry, this slide is actually, we're still talking about printing ink here, and that's somebody wiping the plate. And this, the death of Pepe Illo, down in the lower right, you can see lovely sweeping wipe marks in the ground. So that's quite deliberate in the way in which it was wiped. Thank you, Felicity. If we could carry on, I'm going to start talking about paper now. So as I've said, the Caprichos series were produced on beautifully high quality paper, probably sourced from Italy. And each imperial size sheet could have been cut into 6 separate pieces of paper that would have been used for Caprichos. Yes, so that's it, so that we know that. Goya used a range of foreign papers for his drawing. However, after 1810, when Napoleon's troops invaded Spain, paper was extremely difficult and expensive to obtain from foreign countries. It's probably for this reason Goya used paper from the Capellades region in Catalonia to produce his working proofs for Disasters of War, which was the next series chronologically to be produced. This slide is one of the mills that is still around today in Capellades in Catalonia, and it actually houses a paper-making museum, and it's an 18th century building. In preparation for the exhibition Reason and Folly, the Prints of Francisco Goya, that was displayed at NGV in 1998, the NGV Paper Conservation Studio took beta radiographs, or soft X-rays, of all Goya's prints containing watermarks and countermarks. We have the next slide, please. A watermark is a distinctive logo of a paper mill that is integrated into the paper at the time it is made and is often accompanied by a countermark, which is often the name of the mill or a monogram. This study revealed the NGV's first edition impression of La Pura Makia contained the Bartolome Mongalos countermark for the frontispiece page, and the Murato and Sarawak countermarks are seen in the paper for the prints. The latter two are the name of paper mills located in the Capellades region of Spain. As Goya was closely involved in the printing of this series, it is assumed he was responsible for the choice of paper, and his selection is likely to have related to supply and availability, purpose of use, and perhaps a conscious desire to support local craft and industry. Unlike Italy, there was no strict governance over paper sizes in Spain. Despite this, one of the sizes Serra papers were known to be available in, 31 by 42 centimetres, is the approximate size of the paper used for La Pura Makia prints, indicating whole sheets were used. Thank you. While Goya's preliminary drawings provided the composition for his prints, working proofs were taken from the inked up copper plates to determine if any adjustments were required to create the desired printed image. To produce a print, the paper is dampened slightly so it can be more easily pressed down into the recessed grooves of the copper plate and the ink can be transferred onto the surface. The copper plate and dampened paper are carefully placed on the bed of the rolling press. A printer's blanket is laid on top and the large wheel of the press is turned, moving the bed through the rollers and exerting considerable pressure, causing the ink of the on the copper plate to be transferred onto the paper. This is a beautiful example, again, from Abraham Boss's have in the collection. Next slide, please. It isn't known if Goya had his own printing press or if his working proofs were made with an assistant or professional printer. But some material evidence exists that provides insight into this aspect of his practice. Great technical ability shown in the working proofs of Los Caprichos and La Pura Makia, and where they exist for Los Decorates, suggesting a professional printer may have been involved in their production. Goya sometimes added inscriptions, chalk and ink lines or ink wash to working proof, indicating the title he wanted added, and where he intended to continue etching or introduce passages of tone. However, in Disasters of War, the working proofs do not appear to have been produced by professional hand, and there is speculation they were done by Goya himself. This slide on the left is an example of a Los Caprichos working proof that shows great proficiency and skill in the printing. As you can see, the plate is laid square and the margins are clean and neat and the highlights wiped meticulously to remove all ink. In contrast, there are examples of working proofs on the right for Disasters of War. Evidence Goya may have printed the Disasters of War working proofs includes the presence of fingerprints and ink smudges on the margins, the paper being placed crookedly on the inked plate, and printing imperfections relating to the pressure of the printing press not being correctly aligned. Thank you, Felicity. Regarding wear, there are techniques of greater vulnerability, as Louise may have mentioned earlier, such as the subtle fine aquatint and dry point with its velvety line. These can help us date the impressions and give us a better understanding of the original intent. However, the evolution of the prints and their subtle differences, not only in wear but inking up and wiping the plate, also gives them uniqueness. This is something we imagine Goya may have embraced to an extent, as he certainly seemed fascinated by experimenting with painterly in his approach and doesn't appear overly pedantic. When we view one of Goya's prints, we are looking at the very last step of a multi-stage process, often involving many changes to the copper plate. These changes reflect the evolving composition and wear to the copper plate through use. To achieve different gradations of tone and to make compositional adjustments, a copper plate might go through up to 20 exposures to acid, and many alterations might be made to the plate by burnishing, scraping, direct etching, and the addition of dry point or engraved line. In this mix of variables is the fact printmaking is a kind of alchemy, and unexpected, sometimes serendipitous things happen during the etching and printing process. Louise and I have so enjoyed looking at the many aspects of each print and have spent time trying to work out the steps taken. We very much hope our talk today with Cathy allows many of you to consider the techniques when viewing Goya's prints, and we hope we've taken you on a rather fascinating journey to the studios and print workshops of 18th and 19th century Spain. Next slide, please, Felicity. If you have any further questions about Goya's printmaking, you can, as Louise mentioned, refer to the ebook that we've both written, and this can be found on the NGV website. It's currently on the Goya exhibition page, but it will probably be moved to the conservation section at the closure of the exhibition. So thank you very much.
you so much, Cathy, Louise and Ruth. That was absolutely fascinating hearing more about those details behind Goya and his practice. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you join us virtually. For those who pre-registered for the program, we'll be sending out a survey and we'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences on today's program. And we have many other virtual programs coming up, so please keep an eye on our social media and also on the NGV website. Thank you again, everybody, and thank you again to our wonderful speakers. Have a lovely afternoon, everybody.